Is that it?
Are we online? Right. Yes.
It is, yes.
Oh, it is on water. I find when I have a friend who researches water, I find it really hard to listen to his work.
Welcome, everyone,
Every time I
to
hear
the
water,
first
water
seminar
results,
series
water triggers.
of the new year in the Center for International Development. I'm very glad that we have Dr. Lei Xie here from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I've known Lei for a long time, but we've never actually met before. This is the first time that we do meet in person. Lei has worked for quite a few years for the University of Exeter before she moved to the Chinese Academy of Sciences. She's published extensively on environmental politics in China and environmental governance, social movements, and today she'll be talking about water diplomacy, international water diplomacy in East Asia, looking at the interactions, conflicts, collaboration attempts between China and Kazakhstan over the Yi River. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Oliver. Thanks very much for having me here. It's quite exciting opportunity for me here to share with you my work on countries' behavior in water sharing, which I find is very complex and intriguing. So my focus today is to talk about what makes countries form effective cooperation. And this is an ongoing project, so hopefully I can get comments and feedback from you, and we'll have an interesting discussion. So I call water sharing politics. I will just first share with you my understanding of the conventional thoughts on what people say. So I identify two groups of individuals. One is from international relations scholars who probably could exaggerate about the threats or how countries react when they find that they are challenged by environmental changes, like climate change or water-related disasters in this case. So they say countries will wage wars over shared rivers. And the other group of people who are mostly natural scientists, who are probably a little naive about how countries deal with water sharing. They think that politicians would go for problem-focused cooperation, that they will think about how best to solve environmental issues, or in this case, water management issues. They forget that politicians or politics can be secrecy, or sometimes they would cheat. So I would say that they neglect that international negotiations is multifaceted. So in this case, I would ask you to have an open mind and to remember that interdisciplinary approach will be greatly needed when looking at the politics of water sharing. So in today I'll try to cover in this order to talk about the topic of water sharing. You may find it look like the structure of a paper. Yes, indeed. I like to do talks this way. I find myself better focused, and hopefully you're not lost. Just a few more words on the two-level game theory. I find it useful as a theoretical tool to understand how countries' domestic politics link back to their positions and preferences in international negotiation. So I think with this theoretical tool, it helps us to better understanding this link and the interactions. And also, using the case of Kazakhstan, I will try to also highlight that the context in Kazakhstan is complex. On the one hand, you may see some features of governance as a country of the global south. On the other hand, that you have different actors involved in the process of policy discourses. You have national government, within national government, different sector units, and then you have NGOs, mostly international NGOs, sponsors, intergovernmental organizations that are all actively involved in the building up of Kazakhstan's water policy. I'll also try to talk about China's position. You will see a map, which is very interesting. But probably I will skip a bit on its domestic water management. But if you have any questions about it, I'll try my best to answer those in the Q&A session, because there's too much I can talk about. And then some tentative conclusions that I will draw for today. Right, so let's have a look at international water cooperation. So when people talk about water or countries sharing water, what do they call it? Many actually call it generally like water interaction. It's an interesting term that they use. Some may call it conflict or water cooperation, as the key scholars who study water sharing here in the UK have done. And they also emphasize that countries may constantly get into trouble with other countries when they share rivers. And they may work together as cooperation, but conflicts and cooperation dynamically interact. So you have a process of this. And it seems that there are assumptions of how countries come out of water cooperation. So presumably, the ideal status is for them to get some institutional arrangements set up, okay? So what we're looking at is that countries want to develop water agreements or treaties to tackle the issues that may arise in their water sharing. So some call it conflict resolution mechanisms. So in this case, they may want to tackle the issues of water pollution or the allocation of water quantity in between the countries if they share a transboundary river that runs through the different countries. And the best scenario for many is to build river basin organizations, because as we know, in many cases, transboundary river actually runs through several nations. And from the governance theory, or at least in Western Europe or North America, countries come up with this idea that the best way to govern it is to include all actors, all inclusive actors that share the rivers. So they may be riparian government, they may be river-based NGOs or community groups as stakeholders. So they should have an equal say on how they want to run or manage the river. And this is particularly seen in the governance of the Rhine River. Okay, so my understanding is that I think conflict is a very ambiguous concept. Again, it ignores the dynamics. When do we call conflicts or cooperation? Who think there is conflicts? Let's look at the also how countries interact with each other. The actual institutional arrangements they come up is quite can be confusing. Sometimes we see that they focus on how they want to manage rivers. So they may want to develop some collaboration in water management. So how we share, for instance, how do we share data to prevent flooding? If you use water from the upstream, then for the downstream countries, they will be in a symmetry of accessing those information that help them to prevent flooding that will affect them. So they may want to develop such mechanisms together. The countries could also use water agreements as a symbolic way of building good relationship. So in some scholarly work, we do find that, for instance, on the sharing of the Jordan River, Israel and Jordan would want to deliberately write ambiguous words in their water agreements. So in a way, their focus is not really on resolving how much river each country should have, but rather to use it as a symbolic way to satisfy domestic societies. So these are also called negative cooperation. And I want to challenge the way how we see the progress of forming water institutions. Do we see a linear progress of developing, like how we see in over the Rhine River, river basin based of multilateral governance, that there is an equal relationship between all riparians and the public or community groups are well incorporated? Or how is it developed? Do we see that are those really negative, or the negative, so-called negative cooperation, will they change the nature in future and to really develop toward water management focused cooperation? I think these are too much to ask. And at the moment, the scholarly work explain the differences as a contextual factor. So they say in the global south, or in regions where countries have unpleasant political relations, they may have problems, but maybe in future, hope is always there for them to develop, like in Western Europe or North America, that we have river basin-based organizations where cross-border type of river governance is developed. So my challenge is, what do we know about the global south? So I have some critique here. So do we see countries approach water resource management in the same way? In the Netherlands, we know that they are a country with low, which is threatened by rising sea level, and they have developed conservation with water, with rivers. So they may want to leave space to rivers. But in different places, like in China, what we see is 4,000 years of history fighting river. So this person here is a hero. So he's called Da Yu. So he was before emperor's time. So he was a type of chief, and he's very famous for all his ways fighting floodings and water disasters. So that gives him legitimacy to being an effective ruler in China. And some people even say, China's experiences in fighting water has made, that's the history, how the political thoughts were, government is formed. So this is to say that the Chinese have a clear character in dealing with water, and to them, this is a technocentric way of working with water. So they want to dam it. By damming it, they think it's a way to best benefit from water resources. They want to do irrigation through damming as well. So this differs greatly from other countries. And then we also see that the preferences differ when countries try to manage the shared rivers. Again, firstly, we encounter the sovereign rule when countries will think only about themselves. They don't want to think other countries. Or in other words, the international environmental law actually entitle them to managing river resources within their territory. So by law, whatever they do within their territory is lawfully right. And other times they think that, so rivers have different characters. Well, use the case of the Brahmaputra, which is a very large river between China and India. So the the rain season actually make all the water in India rich enough for the monsoon season. So that gives the Chinese the impression that however they use the water on the upstream, they are not depleting water resources to their Indian neighbors. So that gives them the understanding that they can do it whatever they like, and that won't affect their neighbors. Some other countries have developed this preference to prioritize their work on certain area of sectors of water use. So for instance, I think it's in Israel that they have this culture to prioritize agriculture. So they will put all their resources to agriculture first. And then, of course, the capabilities of countries differ. That also affects their preferences in negotiating how they want to share a river. So in all, I want to argue that the perception of forming cooperation differs significantly among countries, particularly negotiators. So that's the area that we should know more about. So coming to my framework of analysis, I will use this two-level game theory, which is proposed by Putnam in the late 1990s. And I think it suits the context of the Global South, where you see, again, as I mentioned, you have different actors, intergovernmental organizations, the UNs and the UN-associated units, were regional-based NGOs, different sponsors, foreign countries. For Kazakhstan, I will just mention now that they have a lot of UNDP organizations. I will come back to this later on. So the government is not necessarily in a dominating or a powerful position to rule out what they want to do over water management or water sharing. Domestically, you could say that you see power distribution, fight for power distribution among these actors. And then they have different preferences in water management, as I mentioned. So you have different approaches which could be incorporated in their government policy. And then again, you have different understanding of science and technology. So that's the perception of how countries react to environmental changes. Probably Oliver has mentioned this before. That's in your research. So how technologies could provide assistance to encounter or to be adopted in environmental governance. So it's all contested. Before I talk more of the empirical studies, I would just like to mention that I used greatly for this case a combination of methods. So I used discourse analysis. There are some interviews done particularly with the Chinese Ministry of Water Resources. So it's very tricky here. Again, in this case, it's a bilateral negotiation between China and Kazakhstan. To a large extent, I think they keep the information to themselves. There are limited information that we can access about what they talked about, how they agreed. We know that the outcomes is not satisfactory, but the details is hardly accessed. So having some insiders' views are very useful. And I also try to use discourse analysis as theory, because discourse analysis, in this case, when understanding water as a complex issue, it helps us to understand why some policy responses are adopted and why in other cases they are not. In terms of Kazakhstan's domestic policy, for Kazakhstan, I think I'm lucky in one sense because they do upload their information about their domestic, president's talks, speeches, and some parliament documents. So these can be accessed, and it's a good thing that these help to understand the policy discourses. Is there any questions by now? So, if we talk about Sino-Kazakhstan water sharing, we are looking primarily at two rivers, the Ili and Irtis rivers. So I will focus on the Ili River, which you will see a map. Just remember that water scarcity is quite a problem for Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan is a country that's located inland. Let's have a look at the map. So you have the Irtis River here, and the Ili River actually from here. Does everybody see here? Okay, so it's sourced from China in the Xinjiang area, which is a fastly developed region. So they have large cities being built in this region, and they have also industrial sites as well as petrol drilling. So these are all water-intense sectors. And the Ili River actually runs to Kazakhstan, and it's used by several big cities along the river. And also it runs into through Balkhash Lake. So that's the lake that's seriously polluted at the moment, because the Kazakhstan side has also exploited rivers to a great deal. There are big dams, and industrial cities built there. Coming back, so Kazakhstan's sources is water mostly from abroad, and China accounts the largest proportion of the 43% from abroad. And there are other countries like Russia is another country which share rivers with Kazakhstan. And in terms of the water exploitation rate, so that's a way how to calculate what is possessed within the country in water resource and what is the consumption of it. We know generally the global average of exploitation rate is set as about 40%. And so that makes the two countries in an alarming level because they reach that global average. So if you want to see some of the most updated scientific calculations, here it is. If you look at the ratio, that's the rate of water exploitation. It's to divide the total withdrawal by the to divide water resource by the total withdrawal, and that comes up with this figure. And what you also should be looking at is that if you look at the Ili River, the runoff of Ili within China is about 3 times of that in Kazakhstan. The runoff and the resources also makes China naturally possessing more than its neighbor. So all these make the negotiation really hard, which I will come back a bit later on. So if we look at China's status in terms of its international rivers, the country actually shares 42 major transboundary rivers in the different areas, southwest, south, all these 4 corners. And the country, again, is quite based, its position is based on its sovereign rule. As I mentioned, that China is not willing to disclose or consult with its neighbors before it plans or conducts any water projects on the upstream. So don't forget that China is on the upstream of all these large rivers. So that makes China in a unique geographical position. Some say it's an advantage, but to the Chinese, they feel that their lawfully right is not fulfilled, that they feel they're innocent. And although they are not members of the global water laws, there are stories told among Chinese scientists who seem to be true nationalists. They say that the laws in itself, the global water norms or the International Water Convention, mostly are to the advantage of downstream rivers, countries, so that that's not for them to adopt. But their views is not unique, so they feel they are not better protected by these laws. However, there are a lot of signs that the country is trying to consider other countries' interests. So that's debatable, but you could see some of the signs we might mention a bit later on. So in terms of their negotiation with Kazakhstan, China seems very keen to come up with a rate or an allocation that seems to be fair and equal to both countries. But as we said, the Yili River has such a unique character, making China naturally, possessing 3 times of that of Kazakhstan. The situation is very hard. So both sides can't really come up with what fairness and what equal means. So for instance, the Chinese takes a position saying we have a first come, first serve principle. They believe that Kazakhstan has, in the 1960s, built dams over the Yili. So that makes them, entitled to use the river. And the Chinese insist that this is the time the Chinese use more of the river. But I also hear insider stories saying that China would consider, to equally share the river quantity from a river basin basis. So that's to say we add these 2 up and divide it by 2 and to give half to each country. But that doesn't seem to suit Kazakhstan either. So it's a very tricky position, and this is not new. All over the world, we have seen that the discussion of river water quantity allocation is the hardest to negotiate. That's not to say the ongoing negotiation seems to be developed, and they have a few agreements to reach. They have reached a few of them. So in 2001, and another one in 2006, and a recent one to renew that, they have a focus on water quality control. So that's to say that China agrees to share river data with Kazakhstan in order for them to, deal industrial pollution in a better way. As we said, that China's Yili River runs through Xinjiang area where industrial waste is quite abundant. And a milestone reached in between these 2 countries is the Korgos project. So I have a map here. And the Yili River is actually down here. And the Korgos River is a small branch of about 160 kilometers, okay, 148. And what they have agreed is to, as both sides have some lands in here, so they agreed to have 50% divide in between the water resources over this river, so that help them to irrigate the 16,000 hectare of land in total. So to both countries, this is a success. They take it as a good agreement reached, and the understanding, it's an experiment for them. That's what they say, experimental initiative. But in the overall picture, Kazakhstan hasn't really reached an agreement how much they could take from the Yili River that they share with China. So if we use the theories, we see that the international negotiation is called level 1. And level 2 is to look at domestic Kazakhstan water politics. Here you have the actors, the president, Ministry of Water or Ministry of Agriculture, because they have some institutional changes, and they have foreign donors, Asian Development Bank, UN, or UN affiliated units, and EU. Everybody wants to give suggestions and advice, consultations, how Kazakhstan should deal with water. So domestically, the policy discourse is that has represented a large windset. What we say windset means what they want to demand in the agreements. So they want to have the good quantity that they have in mind, and then maybe some quality control. And in particular, actually, all these actors, apart from the president, at least all through the process, the foreign donors have come up with the idea that China poses threat to Kazakhstan's water management. So all this means it's quite a failure for what has come up at international level. So that what we see is that the Kazakhstan president has to restructure the whole water negotiation or the water policy discourse to shy away from his so-called failure in negotiation. So under the president's rule, they have come up with a new policy program called Green Economy. And in this, they advocate that they want to develop sustainably by using water or managing water in a clever and scientific way. And in this case, they adopted widely Western used analytical tool, which is the energy-water nexus concept. So they try to understand, since water is used in different areas or sectors, there is domestic use, the access to drinking water, industrial use, in their case, is to generate electricity, and agriculture use. So they try to integrate all these uses and come up with a better calculation how much indeed they need from the shared rivers. And they found somehow what they would rely on from their neighbors probably is more manageable, at least on paper. And then I think the green economy idea or the advocate suits very well to international donors, so that they come up with the donors' endorsement. Everybody is happy in this case. And if you look at some of the discourses, we see that there are some policy shifts. So remember that everybody agrees in Kazakhstan that China was a threat, and China is the only solution to tackling Kazakhstan's water scarcity. But then again, we have different sayings that the attention now is on the lacking of high quality drinking water, or that the use of technologies could help us to use water more efficiently. So this is the president's saying, and the other two are from some parliamentary members. And And the president saying, I think I should have included it. He even said that many countries are experiencing water scarcity. Kazakhstan is not alone. It's not a big question if we can solve the issue of drinking water scarcity. So that's, if you like, it's a much narrowed focus from the previous understanding that the whole water management is challenged in Kazakhstan. So that's about the case studies. So in this way, there's some more assessment. The president is quite tactical in reshaping Sino-Kazakhstan relations, making China, a better image. So there are some dynamic interactions in between these two levels. In the first level, they failed to reach an agreement to decide on the allocation of water because the expectation is actually quite high. But then the president managed to reverse the level 2 expectation by de-link the issue of China having a negative image. And actually he also managed to develop a new policy discourse on water saving or the green economy. So in this way, he has restructured the whole game and to his favor. And I have some conclusions on the case. Is that so when we try to understand the outcomes of water negotiation, we primarily look at the international level, which is the level 1. But in this case, level 2, the domestic politics, and how these two levels interact is also important. And don't forget that resolving conflicts over quantity allocation is a challenging situation. So in Kazakhstan's case, I think it shows the dynamics of how power distribution or maybe electoral politics have affected how their positions change in water negotiation. So if you look at Kazakhstan's official position nowadays, they will say we are in good terms with China. We are probably still in the process of finding a good rate in terms of water sharing, but that will no longer be the primary focus. And the implications of this case, I think, is that Kazakhstan as a country is quite developed. So with the assistance of international actors, it has become capable of acquiring policy regulations or policy tools that help them to improve their water management so that they could step out from the successful negotiations. So some more words I want to say is that, again, water cooperation, I think, is an ambiguous concept. Probably you want to talk about water negotiation per se. And some ideas for future research is to understand the perceptions and preferences of negotiators, so that help us to understand better how their negotiations will lead to in future and what types of assistance or capacity or knowledge they will need, particularly for the developed societies to provide aid with. I think with that I ended my speech. Thank you.
Okay, so we have plenty of time for questions. Anyone would like to start, Matt?
So, thank you. That was great.
Sorry, Lei, do you mind standing so the camera can still capture you?
So thank you. Really enjoyed that, and I think there's loads of kind of layers to explore in it, and I really think your last kind of point about future research is really interesting. So one of the questions I had, which you mentioned at the start, which was kind of, I think, a kind of methodology point you made, but actually I wondered if it had more significance, was You spoke about how uneven the kind of knowledge and information is that's being made available between different actors. So, you know, in terms of the degree to which Kazakhstan makes available kind of speeches and so on, whereas the Chinese are more reluctant. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, you know, why that is, but what impact that perhaps has on the kind of negotiations and the ways the different players are trying to kind of work with each other. Because if it's highly uneven, you know, that creates quite an interesting, using game theory in particular, creates quite an interesting context.
In that sense of the negotiation, I'm afraid I don't have that much information to provide. Again, because the bilateral negotiations are kept in dark. It's a black box that nobody could really have access to. It's a sensitive issue, of course. But then I could probably talk more about how the Kazakhstan is affected by working with international actors. Definitely they have tried to, in various senses, work with NGOs or EGOs to understand, you know, the technical issues behind water resource management. So if you look at the documents they have reached, the workshops they have organized, there's loads of them, and the focuses slightly differ. The ones they work with Asian Development Bank or the ones they work with the UNs. And I found that, interestingly, most of the Western suggestions or advice are somehow coherent. But to the Kazakhstan case, to the Kazakhstan side, some department has accepted it, like the Ministry of Agriculture, which also plays a role in the negotiation. However, they, in the power distribution game, I think they lost their power to the national government or the president. But still, there's scientists that are there that advocate what they have learned with their Western partners. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it does, and I realise in a way my question was partly about the kind of future research. That's what I suppose I was thinking in a way.
Yeah.
So it's hard to answer, right? Because it's future research. But I was just thinking as you were talking how interesting it must be when you referenced game theory earlier. I was thinking how interesting it must be when you have such uneven information sharing across the different actors. You know, whether Kazakhstan has been very open and, you know, in a sense their president will talk about these things in these ways where that may not be the case.
But then I think that makes Kazakhstan open in some ways, because it's still dominated by the president, and in domestic politics that they have shown that the president has won in different ways to enhance its own legitimacy and power. So in a sense, it's not an equal or fair game as what we see in liberal democracies. And also Kazakhstan again shows some limitations or weaknesses in how it implements the agreement it has with Western donors. So in that discourses, Kazakhstan has still maintained its own will and preferences, and hasn't really received much. Yeah.
Thanks very much. That was an excellent talk, and I really enjoyed it again. And I'm just interested in the level at which the decision making sort of seems to cease. I mean, it seems to be very top down. And I wonder, could you talk a bit more maybe about the role of community and people in their response to local activism and groups like that? I noticed when you had your lovely historical woodcutting picture that it seems to be the local populace were the ones bashing the hammers and things, and driven by, you know, some sort of, you know, again a power dynamic to sort of address the flood control, but you know, in terms of the sort of people within the, you know, how far down does that power, you know,
yes,
and negotiation go?
Sure. Yeah. No. Definitely. It's not something I have included, but I had that in mind, and I did talk with Oliver about. NGOs or community groups are an important actor in every society when we talk about water management. In China, let's start with China. So China has seen its first tide of environmental movement that focuses on water or air. Water is their primary concern. So when I was doing my research about 10 years ago, so that they were opposing dam constructions exactly in the southwest. It was on top of the Meigong River. So that's to say that they are there, that these environmentalists, they want to advocate, the ideas or the benefits of river communities. They think it's not fair for them, and there are such voices. But again, they are different from what we see here in Western Europe or North America. The actors that are directly or actively involved are not the community people themselves. Hardly we see some. There's probably just one group that was in Yunnan province for China's dam construction against China's dam. So they have shown their own characters. In Kazakhstan's case, no, there aren't so many NGOs or movement. There are voices from them. I should have incorporated here. So there should be NGOs or epistemic communities. But NGOs, their voices are similar. That they were with these actors, the last three ones, when talking about how to tackle with China. So they think China is a direct threat, that Kazakhstan should work more to protect the Balkhash Lake. And the scientists provide data on that. But somehow, that's the interesting bit. I think within their interactions with international donors, the scientists' voices get weaker and weaker. Probably they, in their professional knowledge, they have agreed with these schemes and plans. I think that's my understanding of it, so that they withdraw as an opposition, but rather as among them, as a supporter.
Thank you.
Sorry, you mentioned, I think, that there was China's upstream of 42 rivers, I think, or something like that.
42, yes.
Yeah. And I was wondering, considering like growing urbanization and climate change over the coming years, like, can you foresee these kind of agreements and negotiations being strong enough to manage the inevitable conflicts that will come up if China is going to be using more water, and obviously the countries that are downstream and all of these rivers are going to be having these kind of same problems as Kazakhstan. Do you think this kind of negotiation would be strong enough to, you mentioned at the start of the presentation that countries go to war over water. So what, I can't say I'm asking you to predict the future, but what can you foresee happening in the...
To predict for future. So, I mean, it's a good question. That's something I wanted to focus today, to say that my idea is that China will not be in wars, certainly, or in strong political tensions. That's what the Chinese government tries to avoid. But then again, their way of interacting with downstream countries, with the Meigong or with Kazakhstan, the cases are that they come up with ideas how they could benefit from the sharing of rivers. So what I think is for the Chinese to think about is how they could collaborate more, but not necessarily on water management. It's how to benefit from water. So the idea is that water is such an essential resource, but water has multiple uses. So when we talk about water, or the Chinese or the Asians are talking about it, I think they're taking it as an all-in-one type of thing. So they want to develop transport, navigations, dams, and many more, irrigation, tourism, and more areas that they could think about, or some a bit of biodiversity protection that they are doing in the Laos. So China has actually developed some multilateral agreement with the lower Mekong countries called the Lancang Mekong mechanism, which is rather new. It was in 2016. And this comes along, it's compatible with China's new strategy called the Belt and Road strategy. So, so they try to use that to facilitate that China dominates the whole talk, the whole interaction in the region. They exclude everybody. They exclude the EU. No, the EU wasn't much, was it? Not much. Japan, US. So in a sense, it comes to the Western idea that it's inclusive. It's just us. It's China and the lower Mekong countries. But the rationale behind that is that the government comes into control and China comes to the agreement that through this mechanism, states coordination will be possible. But this wasn't in place previously in Mekong with the GMS or previously the MRC, that countries wouldn't just comply or coordinate. But with China being as a facilitator or somehow leader, that it's making it to take place. I'm writing another article on this to discuss China's leadership. And with Kazakhstan, again, I think the Kazakhstan government is trying to divert the attention on water sharing, but their focus is more on develop or maintain Kazakhstan's economic growth. So for them, it's trade with China, it's the pipelines, it's developing other goods or economic transport. I think they're trying to develop transport and trains. So they try to not prioritize on water management. So that's what comes out of the water negotiations.
I just wanted if one of you could talk a little bit more about, you said that China is trying to improve its image.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering what strategies they're using and how successful that is.
It's a big question, I would say. The thing is, I think China sees itself in a dilemma. Dilemma in the sense that it's on the upstream, okay? Everybody thinks that if you're on the upstream, you are a hegemony. You are certainly, able to do whatever you like. You don't have to consult with anyone. If you are a small country, let alone, in this case, China is a big one. But China sees itself not really being able to realize its lawful right as a sovereign. So it has to consider ethical concerns of the downstream countries, their communities, the citizens, human security. So in that sense, it has started to work more with the downstream countries, more than what it intends to do previously. If we look at the early 2000, when it has started to work more on the Mekong River, it really didn't do much of the interactions with the lower Mekong countries. But China was affected by environmental movements. So I analyze that in my book, Environmental Movement in China. So the Chinese government was aware that there is such a strong movement there, which was built transnationally between the Yunnan and some of the countries there with Thai and Laos. So that was back in 2003. So slowly, gradually, the country started to respond to the criticisms, although not as much as we wanted to be. But still, I see that this is a trend coming. But I just want to add more. But the problem with the outcomes of interactions, I think in these countries, not just China alone, it's the government, the national government in these countries. like the Mekong countries or Kazakhstan, they are still in strong control of what they want to achieve, how their national policy plans develop. So still we see state-led cooperation taking a strong control of how to manage the large river basins. It seems, yeah, that's the limitation I found.
Do you think that the fact that countries want to build transport, industrialize, and have trade and build pipelines, these things can be linked to water? So is it easier to not talk about water quantity? Because you said earlier that the hardest thing is to talk about quantity, like quantitative sharing of water. So if countries begin to talk about other things in relation to the water, can be water brought into sort of a basket of bigger things? So does it make it easier to talk about other things and then insert water as a means to provide?
Yeah, I think, yes. Actually, I agree. I think water is more seen as an issue link with other economic issues. To some extent, the issue of water quantity allocation is hard, but then considering how domestic politics has turned out in Kazakhstan, it's not necessarily the biggest challenge. Again, it depends on what they want. They could shift their policies anyway, even in such a situation where the country is experiencing serious water scarcity. But I think the perception of these countries in Asia is that they do not want to prioritize water as water we see here. It's not seen the same way. They see water as economic terms, economic goods.
And thank you for the explanation. Talking about the negotiations and the impact of water discussions into other sectors, do you see any influence or role of the private sector in the negotiations? Since you mentioned it's a state-led situation, but do you see any influence?
Yes, it's a good question. Actually, yes, I do. I think the Chinese, when in their rationale, what has been focused too much from scholarship is to see its political power. But what drives China to cooperate is its interest, its economic terms, so that it wants to have its private entrepreneurs or private corporations to be able to go abroad and develop and make money and do investment there. So that's the case over the Mekong River, and that seems rather successful. But with India, that's a different scenario because China and India's relationship is not so good, particularly with the border dispute. So the Indian government actually has shut the door for private companies, Chinese private companies, to invest in India. And that actually stops much of China's interest to work more with India. So apart from their deteriorating political relations, so India's reserved position is an obstacle, which is a shame actually. The lack of many facilities and investment, but in this case they are not wanting much.
I agree with the economic position and status of the negotiations, more so to the relevance of the China and India position due to the report last year of China wanting to build a dam for electricity supply to Tibet, which would naturally block down one or two Indian rivers.
Blocking down in what sense?
It would actually reduce water flow downstream.
No. Maybe in the dry season, but not in the monsoon season, as I mentioned.
Yeah.
So essentially, to the water supply for the Indians, that wouldn't make much difference. They won't be lacking of any water quantity because of that. And I don't think they're draining it. The worst would be that they divert. That's what the Indians are feared about. They would divert us into into the Xinjiang region. But that's not what is happening nowadays. Some people do question if China wants to have this plan. It is possible. We don't really know. Yeah, but at the moment they are only building dams over these, and that doesn't really have a technical impact on India. Yeah.
Is that though disputed? So is there hard evidence produced on the Indian side on that? So is there an issue about evidence, or is there an issue about?
No, I see it as mistrust.
Okay.
I have developed. I put my some of the references here, so you could have a look at the end of the presentation. Sorry, there. We have an article on this on the Sino-India cooperation between China and India. So that I see it's mostly the mistrust playing a role. So the Modi government actually has reacted differently from the Xi government, the previous government. And the Xi government was accepting China's scientific information, which was limited. However little it was given, the Indian side accepted it. But the Modi government completely takes away of it. They start to challenge, bringing up nationalism and making the communication or interaction between the two countries harder and harder. So that led to the breakout of their water cooperation. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question? And maybe this isn't your area, but I suppose something that I was thinking about then. As somebody who works in India, I suppose I'm particularly interested in some of the things you said. I suppose that going back to the previous question about the dams in Tibet, but also thinking about the histories of water and damming within India that I've been engaged with a little bit. I suppose is there a risk in kind of focusing very much on kind of the diplomacy and so on that we and kind of scientific accounts of water distribution and so on. I suppose there is a side, going back to your nice kind of the wood illustration earlier, that I suppose the ways that the rivers connect in a much more complicated way with people's sense of identity and history and their right to land and right to resources and who they are, which maybe if we were taking those things into account, the volume of water is not the only issue, is it? In a sense, water has meaning and such salience for people. And so I just wondered if that, where that kind of played in this story.
It is quite true. For instance, you could say that the communities living on, the upper range of Brahmaputra think differently. Again, we have read reports that, interestingly, they are passive. They are passive about dams. They don't want to be involved, actually. They don't want to take actions against it. They were organized by some proactive scientists or some other international NGOs. So, again, there's dynamics in that. But at the same time, still, in the issue between China and India, I think the Indian government was very strong-handed, particularly with the Modi government. And it has taken control of it, making it as a resource for its political games, to stay in government and to mobilize nationalism. So, but now with last year's military demonstration between the two countries, China has broke its agreement to provide hydro data to India. So that means they didn't provide it last year, and India has lost, huge loss. And so now it becomes a problem for the Indian government. So I'm due to provide another talk in Delhi in a few weeks' time, hopefully to discuss more about China's position. I
suppose that's also partly about the particular version of Indian nationalism, right? So a kind of and that the Brahmaputra has a particular significance to Modi's version of nationalism, doesn't it? And which would play differently if it was a different iteration of what an Indian nationalism.
Yes, probably from the region where it's more in the north, where his support base was.
And I suppose it relates to Hinduism and his kind of, him being at the forefront of that, doesn't it, particularly?
Hinduism, that I think I need to know more about.
Yeah, we probably all do.
Any other final questions? Yeah.
Sorry, hi. My name is Lee. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really interesting to see how China really have a lot of transboundaries and water management and everything. I want to go back to the one you mentioned about the Lansang Mekong initiative.
Yeah.
Like you were saying, water management in different regions and different countries have values, and it's really constructive. It depends on what kind of version you're looking at. And China, for example, in the Mekong River, didn't join the MRC. And you're saying the MRC is
yes.
limitations and everything, so you come up with the Lansang Mekong initiative.
Yes.
In your opinion, to what extent do you think that this kind of Lansang Mekong initiative will be more effective than the MRC? And what do you think was the larger implications of that new initiative that China put it in? Because there's a lot, like you were saying, there's a lot of negative tension that downstream country having because of the environment issue.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah. I think with the Lansang Mekong mechanism, the difference is it's built on a national level. So in the past with the MRC, you have what is involved in the MRC from these countries mostly are ministers. So that's to say, domestically, they haven't come up to the top level for their government to be engaged in the river basin governance. But with the Lansang Mekong mechanism, China is committed. So these countries become very engaged. For them, the ministers have to be at the top. Whoever is the most powerful would be there. That makes a whole difference. That makes them more, what they say or what they commit will count. And they wouldn't want to lose this opportunity to engage with the national government. So my contact in Laos used to say that they used to work a lot with the Yunnan government in here. So that's with the Greater Mekong region mechanism after the MRC. So GMS, which is sponsored by Asian Development Bank or Japan, has led China to commit only a provincial government. So the RMC countries were saying, we only see mostly the Yunnan people. And now with the new mechanism, they could talk to Beijing directly. So they know what Beijing wants and they know what they can get from the national support. So the new mechanism, Lansang Mekong mechanism, moves on very quickly. It takes up a speed that it has, really promoted some, interstate coordination that hasn't been seen before. So in this sense, you see more political engagement and commitment, and China is directly, using its what's that called, the bank, to provide financial assistance in this. So you have money, you have capacity, commitment, and resources. So that makes it quite a new picture. Yeah, but then again, it's mostly at national levels. To what extent they could incorporate, river basins interests or river communities' voices, these are still questioned.
I think that is a model for other river basins where China just provides financial incentives. Could that be an issue that could be resolved in the Ili Basin with Kazakhstan as well, where a whole different type of collaboration is set up, which uses the river, but which in fact talks about infrastructure development.
Yeah, but I also see some other, environmental issues being tackled. Interesting enough, after China has worked with Laos for a number of years, it realizes that it can do a bit more. So I've talked to some NGOs in Beijing, which are national NGOs, which conduct, capacity building in Laos for Laos communities or government. So the NGO people were very proud. So they are Chinese, and for once they become, representing. I mean, they're involved in this process. And however, the result wasn't optimistic because they find that the Laos part is a bit corrupted. So all the stories, the dynamics, so it didn't work out as planned. However, they were trying to protect some of the biodiversity spots that is identified in global agreements. So China, I think, is taking a lead to promote this because it has the capacity and resources and knowledge. So, so maybe it's possible that China, again, is leading us to a state-led type of top-down sort of governance in the environment as well as economic growth. Yeah.
I'm interested in, it was a great talk as well, thank you very much. I'm interested in the question of water resource management and political instability and how that relates to changes in domestic policy, because it seems that in Kazakhstan were there instances of protests, of anger, and then the government responded with a more green, technologically focused initiatives, because I'm thinking comparatively about Syria, where Syria also had large instances of water resource mismanagement, but then there was zero reaction from the government, and then that led to massive piece of political instability.
It could be anything, I think. It's insufficient, deficient democracy, I see Kazakhstan is. And then it could be a trigger. It's either water or,
but the government in Kazakhstan did respond to water mismanagement and started to look at more technological solutions.
Yes. I mean, it has to, I think the Kazakhstan needs more legitimacy, the sources of legitimacy, because it's such a major issue that is faced for the country. But it could be anything.
Can you say were these were the government able to gain greater legitimacy than through the change in water policy? Do you know that?
I think that's my point. I think the president tries to get a better grip to in facing the failure in negotiations. So he tries to develop a new policy program and a new discourse to distract attention from the public that it has failed to come up with a better position or result.
Other questions? All right, then, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much.